let's start with Tuesday and what happened with the assembled 800 or so of the nation's top military advisors, both from the Army and from the other branches as well. And what was going on with that? Because there was a lot of alarm when Defense Secretary, and it is Defense Secretary, not Secretary of War. I think I might have said this to you before, although the administration has said that it wants to change that name, and I've talked about that before. That has to go through Congress. So it is still legally the Department of Defense. Anyway, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called a meeting very, very quickly for all these top advisors and top military officials to come in from all over the world from their assignments to the Marine base at Quantico, Virginia, on, as I say, very short notice. I think it was 4 days, pulling them off ships, pulling them from their missions, and so on, along with their top enlisted advisors. And many people were extremely concerned about that because it coincided with what looked like and turned out to be a government shutdown. What were they up to? Now, before I go into how that played out, I want to make the point that I don't think we make enough in the United States, and that's that the job of the government, of any government, before it does anything else, the job is to keep the nation safe, safe from invasion, safe from attack. It is to keep the people safe. Now, in the United States, our our land base has largely been safe since World War II. So people tend to forget that the military actually has a job. It's not just part of some international chess game, that in fact it has a minute by minute job of keeping the United States safe. So pulling all these people to one specific place and making it public in that manner was really dangerous and highly, I mean, unprecedented. Nobody does that, or nobody did it until Secretary Hegseth did it last week. So people were justifiably very concerned about whether there was going to be a new policy or what was going to happen at that event. And the first day when he first called everyone together, there was a lot of rumors circling around, and what were they going to do, and was it going to be like, other authoritarian regimes where they kill everybody, or was it going to be a loyalty oath, or was it going to be whatever? Well, news started to drop pretty quickly that this was going to be a talk about the warrior ethos. And I'll be frank, I did not think that that was correct, that there had to be something bigger than that. And in fact, what we saw was on Tuesday was the Secretary of Defense haranguing professionals who are highly trained and incredibly qualified and true professionals, with the idea that the military has to be reworked along some kind of hyper white Christian nationality in order to be truly lethal. And that was deeply problematic, not only because every possible study will tell you the opposite is true, but also because Hegseth was in the military fairly briefly, rose to the rank of a major, but uh, his job before he came to the head of the Pentagon was he was a weekend host on the Fox News channel. So he looked the part of a military advisor to President Donald Trump, but he doesn't have the experience. He is not a career military person, and all the things that one could say about him. So watching him lecture these professionals was deeply embarrassingly painful for those of us who understand the difference between those two things. Now, there was a couple ways that mattered. First of all, is that lots of people talk about whether the military will hold if Trump tries to weaponize them. And I think if you watched that speech, what you saw was professionals. And what really jumped out to me is that um, I talk a lot about the history of the military, which is different adjacent but different than the history of the United States. And a lot of people make the mistake of taking a look at them and assuming that they are partisan. And I have never served in the military, and I could be entirely wrong in what I am about to observe. But what I saw was something that reminded me a lot of myself. That is, when I look at the world, I look at the larger stream of American history. There are presidents I like, there are presidents I dislike, there are presidents I support, there are presidents I don't support. But to me, they are all transient. That is, they're going to be here, they're going to go away, and my loyalty is to the much larger stream of American history. And I get kind of salty when people accuse me of being a shill either for the Republicans or the Democrats. People accuse me on both sides because while I certainly like and dislike different things, I just don't even think that way. And that's what I saw in that military. Those are leaders who are loyal to the institution of the US military and its role in defending the United States of America. That's really different than partisanship. Even if they vote for a Republican or vote for a Democrat, it's a different way of looking at things. And it's important to remember that in the past, when you have seen military figures supporting Donald Trump, they have not been the senior people. They have been much more junior people. And the military frowns on that. That's absolutely not acceptable among the militaries. So what I saw was a number of extremely qualified people looking at somebody who is not going to be there forever and really recognizing how outlandish what he was saying was. Okay, that matters because the next person to speak was Donald Trump, who spoke for 70 minutes, give or take, and you can find the transcripts online. Um, but he spoke in a way that was deeply, deeply, deeply unhinged. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute because I want to work in another question that people asked about the military. And you've said, is Donald Trump going to do what he suggested in that speech, which was use the military against American citizens? And the answer to that is I don't know. First of all, I don't know. I never know what's going to happen in the future, but I want to change the direction of your vision a little bit and recognize, as I keep saying, all of the branches of the military are covered by the Posse Comitatus Act. That's the 1878 law that says that the military cannot be used as a law enforcement entity against American citizens. And someday I'm actually going to write down the history of the Posse Comitatus Act because it's a little bit different than people know. And I think I've talked about it here before. But the exception to what I just said, the military is covered by the Posse Comitatus Act, but the Department of Homeland Security is not. The Department of Homeland Security is a very new department in the United States. And in fact, we want its officers generally to enforce the law. And what I mean by that is within the Department of Homeland Security, we have our coasties, the United States Coast Guard. And anybody who lives on the coast is a huge fan of the Coast Guard. I mean, I guess I shouldn't speak for everybody, but there's a reason we call them our coasties. They enforce the law on the coastline and they rescue people who get into trouble. They're part of the Department of Homeland Security. We need them to enforce those laws. There are also other law enforcement organizations within the Department of Homeland Security that we want to have enforcing the law. People like the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and I think it's explosive devices. I never remember what that last piece is. Anyway, they are not covered by the Posse Comitatus Act. And one of the things that people keep confusing is they keep talking about how Trump is deploying the military in the streets. And yes, there have been federalized National Guard troops and Marines in Los Angeles. There are federalized National Guard troops now in Memphis. There have been federalized National Guard troops in Washington, D.C., and there are now 200 federalized National Guard troops going into Portland, Oregon. That's all true. But the people who are cracking heads right now all across the country are part of the Department of Homeland Security. They are members of either the Border Patrol or of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Those people are the ones who are doing these extraordinary warrantless sweeps that like happened on Tuesday in Chicago, in which they simply went door to door on a 5-story apartment building on the South Shore and took everybody out except one guy who had double barred his door and went back to bed. That man can sleep through anything, apparently. Took them all out and put them in zip ties, including, men, women, children, some of whom were naked, held them outside for hours, ended up arresting 37 of them or detaining 37 of them and telling everybody else they could go. There were American citizens in that group. And again, this is being challenged right now in court as a violation of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, part of our Bill of Rights, which protects people against unreasonable searches and seizures. But when you talk about fears of declaring martial law, Trump is doing this without declaring martial law. This is ICE doing it, and their ICE has a huge budget, and they are detaining people. They are detaining American citizens. This is a huge, huge deal, and it's getting local attention and it's getting some national attention, but not nearly enough national attention, because when it does get attention, as in the case in New York, where an ICE agent took a young woman and threw her against a wall into the floor, ICE has to back off a little bit. So before you worry too much about um, military, I'm sorry, martial law, which, by the way, is not Marshall like James Marshall Hendricks, Marshall. It's Marshall like as in war, Martial, like the god Mars, the god of war. That is certainly something that the administration is playing with, and it's playing with it. We saw in a declaration today that the U.S. is at war with drug cartels, although the administration did not spell out what it meant by drug cartels, and most legal analysts are saying this is just simply not going to hold water. It is dancing around that issue because that would give the president really quite large powers, but it doesn't need that to cause extraordinary havoc among our neighbors. So before you worry too much about that coming, ICE is already here, and ICE is already detaining US citizens as well as undocumented immigrants, as well as immigrants who are here lawfully, whose status sometimes changes because of the changes the administration is making, and are detaining people that they claim are criminals. But we all know at this point they're trying to fill their quotas by taking anybody who might have any kind of warrant or anything in their past, any kind of blemish in their past that enables them to add them to their quotas. So before you worry too much about martial law, remember that ICE is already here, and ICE is already incredibly damaging to the social fabric and to this country. All right, so part of that you asked, where are the detainees that ICE has gathered? And I want to reemphasize here, as I keep doing, the administration is making it very, very, very difficult to figure out what they're doing by simply refusing to release any information about anything. So we know that people are disappearing into the system, and we don't know how or when they come out. There are people who track what appear to be ICE flights to other countries. We don't know the names of the people on those flights. And people ask a lot about the detainees who appear to have disappeared from the detention center in the Florida Everglades, whose nickname I refuse to use. Those people, there are all kinds of concern about what has happened to those people. It's just entirely possible that they have been rendered to another country, that they have been deported, that they are in different detention facilities, that those records are not accessible to people who are trying to find that out, including family members. It does not necessarily, I shouldn't say necessarily, it probably does not mean that they have been unalived, but that they have um, been hidden somewhere, moved somewhere, rendered somewhere, pushed out of the United States into a place where their lives are certainly unstable. But just to lay a little bit of comfort, perhaps anyway, over that. I'm not going to dig too much more into that, but I do want to point out how much what is happening in the United States right now looks like Reconstruction. That is the period in the United States after the Civil War in which a very small group of reactionary white Southerners used terror, which is what the ICE sweeps are designed to gain political control over the American South for 80 years. And the key thing that we have today that Reconstruction era Americans did not have is the ability to communicate with each other and the ability to post videos and the ability to call this stuff out in real time when the administration says, for example, over that ICE raid in Chicago, that they arrested people who were members of a gang. We have the ability to say, as people did almost instantly, you have no evidence of that. You have not produced any evidence of that. And until you do, we're going to have to assume you just did a random sweep of these people. All right. So the other thing that was important about what happened on Tuesday was that Trump, as I say, was not well. He was not well in that speech. And that's not just me talking. I'm going to give you more information about that in a minute. But he was rambling. He was really unable to be coherent. At times he seemed to be reading off a teleprompter, but then he would free associate. And he was treating this meeting as if it were a rally of some sort. Although even his rallies used to be more organized than that, mentally organized than that. But it was not a rally. It was a meeting of the United States military brass, the people who are most responsible for keeping us safe. And what it did by live streaming it was it demonstrated to the world, not just to the United States and not just to military officials, that the president of the United States is not mentally competent. And that's a really, really big problem. And I want you to listen to something. I pulled this from his 70-minute speech, which he started to talk about Joe Biden, who, by the way, he mentioned, I think, was 11 times in that speech, which is highly unusual. But he said, they looked at him falling downstairs every day. Every day, the guy is falling downstairs, which is, Biden was riding a bike. He's still in really good physical shape. And then he said, I'm very careful. When I walk downstairs for like a month, stairs like these stairs, I walk very slowly. Listen to this. Nobody has to set a record. Just try not to fall because it doesn't work out well. A few of our presidents have fallen and it became a part of their legacy. We don't want that. You walk nice and easy. You don't have to set any record. Be cool. Be cool when you walk down, but don't pop down the stairs. And then he free associated about Obama. Listen to what I just read. Doesn't it sound like medical advice? To me, it just really jumped out that he was repeating what a doctor had said to him. Nobody has to set a record. Just try not to fall because it doesn't work out well. A few of our presidents have fallen and it became part of their legacy. We don't want that. You walk nice and easy. You don't have to set any record. Be cool. Be cool when you walk down. I thought that really jumped out in that speech, an admission that there was something physically, at the very least, and I would say mentally, that was certainly on the mind of Trump and possibly of his medical advisors. Now, he did a couple of other things on Tuesday that people didn't necessarily put in the context of Tuesday and probably should have. One is that, remember, it was the day that the shutdown was about to happen, and the Democrats have said they would not give the Republicans cover for the budget reconciliation bill they passed in July. Remember that? That was the budget reconciliation bill that could have everything but including the kitchen sink, which it did, because it only needed Republican votes to pass. Budget reconciliation bills, there are a number of bills, very few, but two, I think it is, bills every year that can go through Congress without having to face a filibuster in the Senate. And someday I'll do a whole nother thing on the filibuster. But one of those is a budget reconciliation bill. So the Republicans needed no Democratic votes to pass that, and they just went for it. They went for broke. They got everything they wanted. They got a major tax cut for extension of the 2017 tax cut for the wealthy and corporations. They got slashing Medicare, Medicaid, but which also is going to involve cuts to Medicare. They got cuts to the supplemental nutrition program. They got cuts to energy, green energy programs, and so on. But one of the things that they appear to have overlooked, because this was done very hastily and it was a huge, huge measure. One of the things they did was they did not extend the premium tax credits. The premium tax credits are subsidies for purchasing healthcare insurance on the Affordable Care Act marketplace. With those expiring at the end of the year, people's insurance rates are going to skyrocket, and they're going to skyrocket enough that healthy Americans are almost certainly going to drop their ACA coverage, meaning they'll be uninsured. But that also means, which is bad enough, but that also about 4.2 million are estimated to be people who will drop off. But that also means that for those who remain on the ACA markets, the premiums are going to go up because the healthiest population just said we can't afford this, we're out. And that means that the population covered by those markets will be sicker and older and cost more to insure. So you're already seeing premiums skyrocketing. The numbers started coming out on October 1st. The Republicans desperately want the Democrats to own a piece of that. And voting for this extension until November 21st would make the Democrats put the Democrats at least a little bit on the hook for saying, okay, we can live with what the Republicans did in what they are calling the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The Democrats call it the Big Ugly Bill. But so the Republicans know this is a losing issue. So they keep saying Democrats want $1.5 trillion for, I think it's trillion, it might be billion. I think it's trillion. I don't know. Sorry, I don't do numbers well. They keep saying that that the Democrats are simply trying to get health care for undocumented immigrants, which is simply not true. You know, they've got, and then Trump started saying they want trans athletes and throwing all kinds of things that have nothing to do with this actual fight and have a lot to do with Trump's usual rallying cries, which just don't have a lot of teeth anymore. So on Tuesday, Trump actually came out and he said, this shutdown is going to let us cut a lot of the things that they want. And by they, he meant Democrats. But he went on to say medical stuff, benefits, you know, the sorts of things that actually all Americans like. And so he did this. And then it was like all of a sudden he caught himself and he said, I mean, we don't want to do that. We're just cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, even though we know that, in fact, the DOGE cuts from the Department of Government Efficiency did not do anything to address waste, fraud, and abuse. But so he did that. And that was on Tuesday. And I have not been madly online today. I've actually been writing, but Trump has not appeared in public since Tuesday, I don't believe. Instead, what you are seeing is him posting on social media deep fake videos, really offensive stuff, and seemingly staying off the stage, which is really interesting because you don't know what he's going to say next. So his handlers clearly do not want him in public. They want to use him to troll people, but they don't seem to want him out there.